with today's webinar. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining today's web event, Talking to Child Victims for Prosecutors. This webinar is brought to you by our colleagues at the National District Attorneys Association and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. Please note that this web event is being recorded and will be published on NTTAC's YouTube page. On NTTAC's YouTube page, please take a moment to view the additional webinars that we have on juvenile justice and child victimization prevention related topics. If you would like to get access to the transcript or any supporting materials of any of those web events, please contact the OJJDP NTTAC Help Desk at OJJDP@USDOJ.gov. If you're having any trouble downloading any of the event materials that I've shared, please send me a message directly to the host, and I can help you to download those items. Also note that we will share a Google link in the chat. My co-host will share a Google link in the chat. So if you're having issues downloading any of those items there, you can also access them through the Google link that my colleague will share. For optimal audio, we ask that you dial out through the WebEx system to your phone line. When connected, you'll see a little headset icon that will appear next to your name in the participants panel to indicate that you are indeed connected. Again, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties during the web event, please send me a private message and I'll be able to help troubleshoot. So we would like for our audience to please be engaged during today's webinar. To do so, we ask that you send any questions or comments engaged with our audience and with other participants, and especially with our presenters through the chat box. If you have a question pertaining specifically to today's webinar that you would like to ask our presenters, we ask that you go to the chat window, you select all panelists or everyone, and then you type in your question and hit send. So again, you would go to the chat, select all panelists or everyone, type in your question that you have related to about the content, and then hit send. And our moderator will keep track of those questions as they're coming in. We will be able to address your questions during and at the end of today's presentation. Help us count. If you're viewing by yourself, there's no need to do anything at this time. However, if you're viewing in a group, meaning it's yourself and other individuals, please type the total number of additional people in the room with you today, not including yourself. So if you are viewing with a fellow prosecutor, you would just put +1. If you're viewing with 2, you would put +2. So please type the total number of additional people in the room with you today, not including yourself. You can do that in the chat, and you could send that to all panelists, or you could send it directly to me, to the host. After today's webinar, you will receive a certificate of attendance within 24 hours via an automated email from OJJDP's NTTAC. Please keep an eye in your email for your certificate. This is the agenda for today's webinar. And now I would like to turn today's presentation over to our moderator, Ms. Rachel Larson. Rachel, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am a senior attorney at the National District Attorney Association in the Juvenile Justice section, and we are using grant funds to provide free training to juvenile court prosecutors across the country. I will put my information in the chat so that if you would like to inquire about bringing a training to your state, we can talk about that. And I'll put some other information in the chat regarding getting CLE credit for today's course. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Scott Snyder. I have known Scott for going on 15 years. He testified in a case that I had in juvenile court, and his calm, uber professional demeanor on the witness stand was nothing short of amazing to a brand new baby ADA like myself at the time. And I got to really know Scott when he presented at a forensic interviewing course that I was hosting for prosecutors in North Carolina. Just before the course was to take place, there was a huge snowstorm in North Carolina. Now, for those of you from Minneapolis or upstate New York, you might think that's not a big deal. I travel in everything but a blizzard. But in North Carolina, we don't have a lot of snow plows, and we definitely don't have snow tires. Plus, everybody really freaks out when it snows in North Carolina. So, and people act crazy on the roads. But Scott nonetheless got in his car and drove about 2 hours to deliver this training. He's an excellent presenter. I think a national treasure in this regard. He's presented all across the country on the topic of forensic or diagnostic interviewing. And he works at the Duke Child Abuse, Neglect, and Diagnostic Clinic in Durham, North Carolina. And I'm happy to present him to you here today.
Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciate that. And we don't have any snow today, so that's a really good thing. First of all, thank you for having me. Thanks for all the participants to take their time to spend with us this afternoon. Just very briefly, this is my introduction. I really appreciate Rachel's kind words. Just in sum, what I do as a living is I work in a medical evaluation clinic, a part of a specialty team at Duke University Medical Center. I've been here a little over 19 years. Was interviewing kids in a district attorney's office in Cambridge, Massachusetts for about 3 years before that. Long story short, I interview kids. I talk to kids every day. What I'd like to do today is talk with you about talking with kids and sort of building that relationship and hopefully some valuable information for you as prosecutors, particularly in your work with these kids. So just to get started, but I do want to say, again, the disclaimer in terms of the project, but wanted to give a disclosure. Sort of full disclosure, part of my role here is also training other interviewers. And in North Carolina, one of the models we use and one I train for is the co-author and co-trainer is the RADAR model. I'm not going to advocate or endorse or recommend any particular model of interviewing. We'll talk about all different models and how really to talk with kids that is not related to any specific model. I will include some information or some terminology that's included in RADAR model, but again, not endorsing any single one. So what I'd like to do is, again, I want to make this practical and usable to you folks in the field. So a really brief overview of where we are in the interviewing field. We want to talk about children's language development, how they're different than adults. Talk about factors that may affect children's language, but also their reporting ability, including issues like recantation, which I know you folks so deal with it on an occasional basis. And also really just to communicate, not only with children, but with older teenagers, even with adults. So definitely different ways to talk with people, because the idea of all of this is really to get accurate history. So how do you talk with people, build a conversation, have a decent working relationship with people of all ages so that you can get really good information to help the case outcome. So that's what we're going to try and get done. So again, I'm not going to, each one of these sections, let me just preview. Each one of these sections could be, an entire day or entire session. So just some of this may be some brief overview. There will be time in between different sections to ask questions. Be happy to answer anything that's needed, either in this session, email later. So we'll get through things as we go. Just a real brief history. Want you guys to understand that the field of child interviewing and talking with kids is not a very old field. And you're going to see this sort of this dichotomy between two different ideas. One would be early on, there's this what we call the sensitivity or era of sensitivity. And that early on, a lot of the models that we talk to children about abuse and neglect was there's this idea of suggestibility being less dangerous than the perpetrator's influence on the child. And the emphasis mainly was on false negatives. We're missing kids. We're missing it because it's really hard to say this. It's really hard to report abuse. So we're missing a lot of abuse. So that was a major theme in that era. And like everything else in life and every other field, there's a pendulum. And the pendulum basically swung in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s into what my colleague Dr. Everson calls the era of specificity. And that really had this idea of, if you just ask the kid, they'll tell you. It's not that hard to talk about it. If you ask them, they'll tell. Interviewer suggestion within the interview is much more dangerous than anything outside of the interview. And then this idea that the main concern being false positives, right? You're getting a yes because yes, something happened to me because the interviewer's influence as rather than an accurate report. The good thing that you're going to see is wherever you are working from, nationally, even internationally, there's different interview models. And typically what's happening now in the field is that there's an emphasis on forensic balance, meaning we're not overcalling, we're not undercalling, we're trying to be objective as much as possible. And the interviews themselves, there are many different models used, but most of them are child-centered. They have flexibility. They may have some scripting, some language in it, but it's definitely child-friendly, definitely scripted for guidance as opposed to a rote interview, every single interview being exactly the same. With the need to have some flexibility per the child that you're talking to. So that's a really nice movement in the field itself. And you're going to see different models. And again, I just want to introduce you to this idea. Depending on which part of the country you work in or other countries, there are different models in the United States and abroad. Most of the United States, you'll see some of these models. There's a very, very good article for those who are interested, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. It's APSAC. Many of you may be familiar to that organization, but if not, it's a great organization to join. I don't, to plug, I don't get any money for it, but it's what they do is provide support for professionals working in this field. The Advisor, so publication came out in September 2020. And it really outlines most of the major child interview models that are used across the United States. And again, for anybody working in this field, we'll talk about these models, really would behoove everybody to get used to the idea of what your model is in your jurisdiction. It could be NICHD, which is like the mother of all models. 40,000 plus interviews researched in the country of Israel. Many of the other models listed here are influenced heavily by NICHD, adapted through that. And again, each one of those has slightly different ways of doing things, but they're outlined very, very nicely in this Advisor article, September 2020. And so to familiarize yourself, that's the quickest way to sort of see every model across the country. Okay. So the idea here is really not to learn about every single interview model across the country. The idea here is, so what does that mean to you? And the main component I wanted to make sure is to emphasize is, the interview, when a child's being interviewed, some agencies, some jurisdictions do it at a child advocacy center. In my area, it's a child medical evaluation. But essentially, there's children being interviewed because of a concern for abuse and neglect. That interview is only one component of your case. You have to use the interview for what it is and what's not. The interview doesn't prove anything. The interview is simply trying to get accurate history from this child about what may or may not have happened. And a solid interview really gives you a lot of corroborative details. It's not just, that a certain part of the body was touched, a certain part of the body was touched in a certain room, and here's how the clothes were. What you're really looking for is as much corroborative details as possible. What would happen before, what was happening after. We'll talk about this in a bit. And using that, because the investigative agencies, Child Protective Services, law enforcement, are the ones that use the information from the child interview to try and corroborate those details, really. They could also refute those details, and so really placing the child interview in its context, in its role within this piece of a puzzle that can be a prosecution. And that's really the idea of the models. So I think when you're talking about child interviews and the child interview models and child interviewers, I think these are sort of the talking points, if you will. I always advocate in the cases where I have to testify here, Rachel was kind enough to talk about testifying with her, is really talking with your interviewers before trial. And before trial is not 5 minutes before trial. It's not a day before trial. Give them lead time. If there's questions, particular things you want to talk to them about the model, learn the local model that you use in your jurisdiction. Learn also how to defend those models. Talk to different prosecutors who you worked with. Talk to different prosecutors in your jurisdiction, nearby jurisdictions who use the same model. What kind of attacks have defense attorneys, provided on this particular model on interviews? Because you really want to be prepared and have your interviewer prepared for what the interviewer is allowed to say, making sure they know the bounds of what they're allowed to say, what they're not allowed to say. All these issues of believing the child, whether it's truthful, this actually happened, that's all the judge and the jury to decide. So making sure your interviewer understands what the bounds are, what the particular case is related to, how that model and how their interview may be attacked, for whatever mistakes may be made. There's no perfect interview. Definitely advocate going yourself to an interview training. Rachel and other folks maybe provide some resources to this, but understanding not only the model from reading a book about it or reading the model that somebody sent you, but an interview training where you actually get to understand the reasons behind the way things are phrased, the way things are structured. I think it's invaluable to understand everything about your case. And with the child interview being a critical component, one component, but a critical component of the case, I strongly advocate these issues. Talk to your interviewers before trial, learn the model, learn what attacks are going to be posed against this model. And then also, if you understand this interview model really well, you can spot whether there's things in the model in this particular interview before trial even starts. You say, hey, look, I understand how this is going to be attacked because I know this model. This interview may or may not have done that. We can address that pre-trial. So you're really prepared for that. Okay. So I hope this is making sense so far. In terms of interview models, obviously is another huge issue. Is not this presentation isn't to learn all about the models themselves. It's really sort of coming down into what I would like to do is sort of overview of things and then come down to what's relevant to you folks. And part of this is also, you may have child interviews at some point. You're going to talk to your child. And again, every jurisdiction is very different. I'll be clear. Like some jurisdictions, the prosecutor and victim witness advocate may talk much more with the child. Sometimes in jurisdictions, they don't meet the child until very late in the process. Everybody's really different. But I want to give you a handle on not only understanding how, when you're looking at interviews that other people may do, sort of understanding what they're doing, what's good or bad or negative or positive about what they're doing, but also when you're talking to the child, how do you develop that relationship? How do you work with this child? Things to look for working with the child and the family. And part of this is also the question types and formation, okay? So whether it's interview or you, but if sort of tips for you, there's different types of questions when you're talking to kids and when you're talking to adults. So part of it is also the idea that there's, except for the bottom one, there's not really bad questions necessarily. There's just least and preferred. The idea of it, you may have heard this, narrative invitational questions. Tell me about that is the ideal question, because what you're accessing is called recall memory. It tends to be more accurate. It tends to be more detailed. You're accessing a memory, and the child actually refers things in their own words. Open focus questions are the what questions, WH, what, where. They also can be recall questions. But even like, really valuable questions like how did you feel about that is technically an open focus question, but it's a really good open focus question. But again, you see the limitations. As the narrative questions are the most information, tend to get more information. Open focus questions, what's your favorite sport? A multiple choice question or a choice question, again, you're narrowing the focus of what you're looking for. And you're setting the parameters and you're accessing what's called recognition memory. So you tend to get very limited information by these questions. So multiple choice questions are not evil, but I personally try to avoid them as much as I can because I'm limiting the focus of what the child can answer. A yes/no question. Again, a yes/no question is not evil in itself, but you get a yes or no most likely. So understanding the types of information you get are directly related to the type of question, how you phrase it. The only question that's not okay, and we'll talk about leading suggestive questions, would be leading suggestive questions are two different things. But a leading question particularly, it asks for a particular response. We'll get to that in a minute. So of all these on this list, the leading or tag questions are the ones that are not okay. Okay. So what is a narrative question, right? I mean, people say, oh, part of my, I guess not pet peeve, but professional peeve is, I think there's a lot of training out there. Do this. You're supposed to do this. You're not supposed to do that. But what? Okay, so how? Why? How to operationalize it? So let's just kind of get back to basics. So a narrative question. So what is a narrative question? To me, there's different definitions, but really what a narrative question is for me is you're getting someone to explain things in their own words. You're accessing that recall memory and the child explains or the person explains things in their own words. It gets really, really repetitive to say, oh, well, tell me about that. Oh, well, tell me about that. Well, tell me about that. Tell me about that. So you can ask different narrative phrasings by using different words, but still access that. So again, you said that, tell me about that. Tell me everything about that. Even by saying, what do you mean by that? Child says they were touched on their private part. What do you mean by that? What do you mean your private part? I don't know what that is. Help me understand is a really nice phrasing. Help me understand that part. You said, if he came in the room and you got scared, help me understand that. And always what happened. Notice a what is a what question. What happened is a what question. So you think it'd be very narrow focused, but what happened opens up the floor to the child and accesses that recall. So again, ways to ask narrative questions without just sounding like a broken record. And kids will nail you on this. I had one child who I kept on saying, I'm confused about that. Help me understand that part. I'm confused by that part. Help me understand. And finally, about halfway through the interview, she said, I'm really tired of you getting confused. So like they understand it gets repetitive. So there's different ways to phrase these kind of questions. Understanding, however, if you're watching another person's interview or if you're talking to kids, you can use other forms of questions. You can't just use tell me about questions in every single situation, every single question. Other questions are allowed, except for the leading questions. But yes/no questions are allowed. What questions are allowed. It's just we like to have narratives first. Try to see what the child will say first, and then you can clarify things with other types of questions. And we'll talk about this. So we don't try those narrative phrasings first. If you're looking at an interview, or we'll talk about how to talk to kids, you want to try those narrative phrasing first. Help me understand that part. You tell me about that. Then you can revert to the what, where, yes, no questions and sort of get an understanding of certain details. The problem becomes when you ask particularly serial yes, no, like serial meaning one after the other. And let me explain this. Part of it is that recognition question. You're accessing recognition memory. A multiple choice and a yes, no is a recognition. Is there a right answer? I'm picking that out of the questions, out of the parameters that you provided. And so they tend to have a higher risk of inaccurate reporting, generally, not everyone. But the other issue is the use of serial yes, no's, because what you start to sound like is your hypothesis testing. And let me explain what that means. If you're talking to a child, the child has said, this person touched my private part. you start asking serial yes/no questions one after the other, see how it sounds like hypothesis testing. It's something you think might have happened, you're trying to confirm it. So it sounds something like this. So the child says, this mind will test my private part. Oh, were your clothes on? Did he touch your butt? Did he use other parts of his body? Did anybody see it? So you're asking these serial yes/no questions, and it sounds like you have an idea of what it is, and you're trying to get the child to confirm or deny your idea, as opposed to, hey, you said your uncle touched your private part. Tell me everything about that, and have the child explain. Okay. So again, a lot of these issues are, I want to give you sort of overview of what we're talking about and sort of how it may pertain to building a relationship with the kids you're going to talk to. But I think a big issue here, not only in the interviewing field, I'm talking to new interviewers and even experienced interviewers, and different jurisdictions have different ideas about what's allowed, what kind of questions are allowed. And leading suggestive questions is probably one of the biggest sort of sticking points. And I think the biggest problem of this is sort of the danger of these types of questions, but also of a lack of understanding. So here's my take on this. If you're looking at these questions, you can use chat box if you want. Maybe a poll question would have been interesting, but it's fine. Just for your own sort of thinking. If you were to look at these questions, are these questions leading or suggestive, in your opinion? Did somebody do something to you they should not do? What do grown-ups do when they get mad at each other at your house? Is that leading or suggestive? Tell me about the time your uncle showed you private parts on the tablet. And here's the thing, we're talking, so I'll define this in a couple slides here. But I run into people who do interviews and even like, did someone do something to you they should not do? Are you suggesting that somebody might have done something like that? Yeah, you kind of are. I mean, there's no way around that. Here's the question. What can the child respond? Can the child respond in any particular way to that? And the answer is yes. The child is absolutely able to respond in any particular way. So while there is some level of suggestibility in there, the child is still can respond any way they want. What do grown-ups do when they get mad at each other at your house? Am I suggesting the fact that grown-ups might be mad at your house? Yeah, I am. There's actually Tom Lyon, who's another researcher, who's a fantastic guy. He's at the University of Southern California. Highly recommend you look at every piece of his work. It's all brilliant. His name is Tom Lyon, L-Y-O-N. And he just did an article, a paper about this, about a very valuable what question, what? And I think he uses a question similar to this. Yes, there is some level of suggestivity there. You're suggesting that people do get mad at, is that completely out of bounds of people's experience? You're telling me the alternative is that everybody's house is completely blissful all the time, there's no arguments, which is really unreasonable. And I think juries would understand that. Now here's the really fun one. The next one, tell me about the time your uncle showed you private parts on the tablet. Here's the difference. Has the child reported this to the interviewer at this point? So here's the question. If that question, tell me about the time your uncle showed you the private parts on the tablet, occurred before the child has disclosed or reported that, that is a highly inappropriate question. In other words, prior to any report or disclosure by the child, to ask or to give you that prompt is highly inappropriate because you're telling the child something happened and asking them to confirm that. If the child has already reported something within this interview, if the child told the interviewer, yeah, my uncle showed me private parts on the tablet, this actually becomes a really, really good question because the child already told you. And then you're just saying, hey, tell me about the time, tell me about that. So this is one of the favorite tactics that I've run across with in trial, is taking a transcript of my interview and highlighting this, and the defense attorney will say, here's, can you read question number 61? And it has something like this, tell me about the time your uncle showed you private parts of the tablet. And the defense attorney will say, well, isn't that a leading suggestive question? And I have to say, well, no, it's not, because if you look just ahead of that, the child had reported to me that in their child's own words that the uncle touched, showed her private parts of the tablet. So I'm simply saying, tell me about that. So it really depends on when these things occur. But here's the thing. There's a difference between leading and suggestive questions. And I think the problem is that these two things get conflated. The problem is that people say leading suggestive as if they're two different things. And in my view, they're not. There may be other definitions in books and research, but to me, this is what it comes down to. A suggestive question introduces the idea that something might have occurred, but it does not encourage a particular response from the child. The child is free to say whatever they want. Now, there is some potential risk for the child agreeing to that question. So they had to be used carefully. But suggestion comes in different ranges. And generally speaking, the more details that you add into the question, the more highly suggestive it becomes. So, did something happen to you is mildly suggestive. I'm suggesting something did happen to you, but the child can say whatever. They can say, yes, somebody knocked me down on the bus. They can say, yes, my brother pushed me down in the park. It has nothing to do with abuse or neglect. If I add more details, do something to your body when you're at camp, you can see it's a little more detailed and more specific. And so that becomes some moderate suggestion. I'm suggesting not only that a location or some particular act, so that becomes a moderately suggestive question and should be used with caution. And a highly suggestive question, you can see there, did a particular person, a camp counselor, do a particular thing, touch your private at a particular place? That's a highly suggestive question and tend to be out of bounds. Okay, so those are the types of questions that I would not sanction. I would avoid in an interview. I would avoid for other interviewers to use, or even people talking to kids. But there's a range, and generally mildly suggestive questions are fairly acceptable. And you can explain this and have your interview explain this in court. I think most reasonable people can understand. If I ask, what happens at your house if somebody gets mad at your house? I think most jurors will understand that people get mad at people's houses. But again, the more highly suggestive it becomes, the more out of bounds it becomes. Moderately suggestive questions you can use with significant caution and with some planning about how the phrasing is going to go. Either one of these, if you ask a suggestive question, particularly a screening question, did a camp counselor do something to you that you shouldn't have done? The child says yes. Then you can mitigate these by saying, going right back to the narratives, tell me about that. Tell me everything about that. And that's one way to have the child explain. So for instance, if I'm talking to a child, at some point I might say, hey, there's things that people shouldn't do to private parts. Did someone do something to a private part of your body they should not do? It's a moderately suggestive question. The child says yes. My next response is, tell me about that. What do you mean? And the child says, well, when I was a baby, my parents changed my diaper. Has nothing to do with abuse and neglect. So I'm not pulling for a particular response. That's the difference between suggestive and leading. Okay, highly suggestive questions are not okay. Now, leading questions are a whole different thing. You guys know this really well. A tag leading question. Your father hit you, didn't he? You're asking the child to respond yes. The flip side of tag question is what you hear in court a lot. Isn't it true that you saw this child? What does the person really want you to say? Yes. They're wanting a particular response. That's leading into a particular response. And a presumptive leading question is what we talked about. If a child has not said anything about abuse, and the interview goes in and says, hey, look, I know your father hit you. What'd your father hit you with? You're assuming something happened, presuming it, and then asking the child to confirm it. Again, completely inappropriate. Okay. And the reason I bring this up is this sort of conflating these two subjects tends to cause confusion. And just want to make sure that interviewers very often do have some level of suggestion in their questioning. The key here is, which we'll talk about sort of how to get an account, is to limit those suggestive questions, particularly by use of narratives and trying those narratives first, which tend to limit the suggestive questions. Okay. So at this point, just want to, I know this is kind of a quick down and dirty kind of idea of some concepts. We're going to talk about children's language a little bit, just again, very quickly, just give you an idea of how different age kids talk and what they understand. but really want to save a bunch of time for really how to talk to kids, how to build a relationship with them, how to talk to them, how to get a full account from them, and then how this is all related to what you guys do. So I don't know, Rachel or anybody else, if there's particular questions asked at this point, I'm happy to talk now, or if we can move on, either one.
I think we can move on and get to the end questions then.
Okay. So look, again, this presentation, even the children's language and the types of questions, can really be expounded upon. I just want to give you a flavor of things. This section is sort of understanding that children's language is different. Before I even start, actually I want to give credit where credit's due. The American Bar Association, this is actually in the bibliography. Anybody working with kids who are going to be talking with kids, teenagers, there's a book called The Handbook on Questioning Children. It's by Anne Graffin Walker and Julie Keniston. It's in the bibliography. The American Bar Association is the publisher. A lot of this is based on that work. And it's really just a really quick read on how kids understand language, what questions they understand, what they don't understand. I highly, highly recommend it because in terms of question formation, it's incredibly helpful. But generally speaking, just to give you a sense, there are definitely different age groups and age levels and developmental levels, and understanding what you'd expect if you're watching somebody else talk to kids or if you're talking with kids. And starting off with the young ones, 0 to 2 it's really not a lot of language development. I'm not going to go into that. But by 3, these preschool kids, many jurisdictions do talk to 3-year-olds. I talk to 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. They're just a different animal, if you will. But really what you'd like to see with 3 and 4-year-olds is they can report accurate history. They tend to have trouble with narrative phrasing. They tend to have trouble with giving a full narrative account, lots of details in their own words. They generally limit to who, what, where. I mean, think about this. If you have 3 and 4-year-olds, you say, who was at your birthday party? They can name some people at the birthday party. You say, well, what did you get for your birthday? They could say, I got a toy truck. But if you said, tell me everything about your birthday from beginning to end, they'll probably go, we ate cake. So they often only report what's important to them. They don't really know what you need, and so they're trying to understand a little more about this. But if it's important to them, it's relevant to them in their moment, then they'll tell you. Otherwise, it's hard to get them in that moment. The biggest thing for this age group is the who, what, where, and if you push beyond that, you're going to push beyond the child's developmental capability, and it would be the equivalent of me trying to do brain surgery, right? I mean, if you ask me to do brain surgery, I kind of know where the brain is and I kind of know where to make an incision, but after that, I kind of know what a brain looks like. But if you ask me to describe it, I'm going to start guessing. And that's what you do when you start asking kids things beyond their developmental level. You're going to get really poor information. You're going to get information that's probably inaccurate, some guessing, and it could make a really solid information look really bad because you push beyond what the child can do and the child starts giving confabulation or things that don't make any sense. So really less is more. Who, what, where, okay? These are kids who don't do well with tell me about, but they do okay with what happened. Oh, so, Johnny touched you, what happened? Have them try and explain things. Again, this multiple choice questions are difficult. The reliability here gets a little strained. So, yes, no questions are sometimes needed, but they do fairly well with the open focus. Who, what, where. There's a huge variance between a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. There's huge variances between a 3-year-old in this family versus 3-year-old in this family. So it's not that every 3-year-old is interviewable or not interviewable or can report or not report. There's tremendous variability. And really what I've come to learn is, giving these kids a shot, see what they can do. There's difference between being able to say that's a table, that's a chair, and being able to report information. But they're capable, in general, 3 and 4-year-olds are capable of giving accurate history. What you need to think about, though, if you're talking to those of you who try to talk to a 3-year-old or have 3 and 4-year-olds at home, expect distraction, right? You get a little bit of focused discussion, maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 different questions, and then distraction. And then spend all the time and then redirection, getting back into that subject, and then a little bit of work, and then that's what it is. And it can take more than one interview. It can take more than one session, and very often. So again, these are kids who may need more than one session to really sit with you or the interviewer to really get a lot of information. Now, here's the thing. By age 5, you're starting to get into this idea. I don't know biologically, I don't know why, but there's this sense of this, starting school maybe or whatever, but they start to give this ability, a little burgeoning ability to respond to tell me about questions. So if you say, what happened? Tell me about that. They tend to have a little more ability to give you at least 2, 3, 4 little details about that in a narrative way in their own words. They still require the what, open, focused, and that's fine. Still developing the who, what, where is really solid, with some developing narrative skills to explain their experience in their own world. So, that birthday party, they might give some more details about that. What happened to your birthday? Oh, they might tell you 2 or 3 or 4 things about it. Oh, I had cake, and we played hide and seek, and then and then we got a bunch of presents. Some key things here with these age kids is they get lost a lot with pronouns. Like if you say like, well, what did he do? What did she do? Sometimes they actually switch. So the child's talking about a boy, and he'll say she. Talk about a neighbor and it's a friend. Talk about an uncle and it's a cousin. If you repeat, well, what did he do? What did she do? They have a hard time tracking it. So you have to really use the person's name. So if it's the person's name is Mark, oh, you said Mark hit you. What did Mark hit you with? As opposed to what did he? The one big concept here for this age kid and really every kid is this idea of avoiding a judgment. We're not saying that what did that bad man do? Let the child describe the person. Let the child describe what they think. What do you think? Is that person nice? If not, okay, what does he do that's not nice? Have the child explain that, as opposed to putting your own value system on the child. That really goes for any age group, but particularly for this age group is quite important, in the younger group as well. The one thing to think about with this really important, this age group, is that even 3s and 4s and up to 5s, and even sometimes later, is that they use words before they understand what they really mean. So I've heard 4 and 5-year-olds use really, really foul language, right? Do they understand what that language really means? Like when they're swearing, they've heard it, but they don't really know what it means. But they'll say things that don't seem to not make a lot of sense, or they'll say things that for the adults, like, oh my gosh, what is that? But they don't really understand what the word is. So part of an interviewer's job is to sort of understand that. And I just had a child recently who had a childlike phrasing. She said she was allergic to something. I said, to what? She said red milk. And in the interview, I was just flummoxed, and I was trying to ask these questions like, what's red milk? Like, where's it come from? What does it look like? Because it was stupid because I couldn't figure it out at the time. And I asked a colleague, and she's like, of course, it's whole milk. It's because whole milk comes with the red top or the red packaging, whereas skim milk comes in the blue. And I couldn't figure out in the interview, but of course it made sense. And that's what you see with kids this age. You have this sort of childlike understanding where a Q-tip with a cotton ball is a swab. They have a different way of talking in a very concrete way. I see in the chat box that Ann Graffin Walker and Julie Kennis's book will explain a lot of this in detail. It's fascinating. So again, definitely refer to that book. Age 6 to 10, you're getting to really kind of fun age, because they're getting to this point where they're very eager to hang out with adults. Adults still seem cool, but they also can do a little more that tell me about. They do a really good job. It's crazy how, if you get out of the way and sort of say, hey, tell me about that, how much they can really explain. This narrative accounts, and what you're looking for, which we'll talk about in a more detail, is this chronological sequencing. Tell me about what happened from beginning to end. They're more able to do that. Well, first this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, which is really valuable when it comes to abuse and neglect reports. The problem comes with this age group and with other age groups is when professionals are dealing with kids and how to talk to them about really hard concepts, or even names, a courtroom. The judge is going to go there, and there's a defense attorney and prosecutor, and you're going to hear some arguments, and they're going to argue the case. Well, to a child, that's really complex language. Concepts are really hard. They might not understand what you're talking about. And so breaking things down into much more simple language. Well, there's going to be one person who's going to be for this person's side, one person I'll be talking for you, and I'll be talking to you, and you'll be sitting up in a chair. And there's going to be a person in a black robe who's going to just be sitting there listening, making sure we're all following the rules. That's a much easier thing to understand. Okay. So they don't understand things, and they might seem like they do, and they really don't. And that's the other thing that happens when the kids get older. Don't be fooled by your 15-year-old who's, streetwise, street savvy, all acting mature, all thinks they know everything. They're not going to necessarily admit that they don't understand it. So really helping children and even teens break things down, making sure they understand things. Just when I said that, what's your picture of you in court? What do you think it's going to be like? And a 15-year-old might have a very different view of what court's going to be like than what it really is, and that misunderstanding can come into play. Children, by the time they get to older, they can give really, really nice detailed accounts. But even those detailed accounts can be disorganized, can be a little incomplete. So you're going to have these kids, even if you say, tell me everything about what happened, and they give you 3 pages worth of notes, it may stray off topic a bit. You have to kind of redirect them a bit. You have to sort of say, well, there's not every single thing I ever want, so you might have to follow up with that kind of, with different details. They still have difficulty, and this is what I see in court a lot, unfortunately, is this, isn't it true that, all this double negation, complex, during the time that you were at that apartment, were you living with your parent, or were you living with your uncle, or who are you living with? That kind of sentence structure is you're going to lose adults that way. They're not necessarily going to tell you, I'm confused. So again, being careful how you phrase questions and not treating them like a little 4-year-old, but also being very clear with your language. Understanding this concept of suggestibility, there's a concern that suggestibility, meaning I can introduce a topic, have the child agree with that topic. That's what we were talked about. By age 11, you're not really as worried about those levels of suggestibility. You still should not ask highly suggestive questions. But in terms of the levels of suggestibility for most kids, by 11, they're no more suggestible than adults, typically speaking. Again, these are generalities, but you still avoid the highly suggestive questions, certainly avoid the leading questions. It's not that I ask more suggestive questions when I'm talking to teenagers. I still want to use those narrative phrasings, and they can be actually better with those. The narrative phrases are really valuable because they avoid a lot of suggestibility. If I say, tell me everything about that, the child, says whatever recalls into their mind. So you're really avoiding that suggestibility with narrative questions. So generally speaking, though, when you're talking to kids, and we're going to talk about building relationships, but generally speaking, you get a flavor for different age groups. One of the best things you can do when you're talking to somebody, when they're on the stand and testifying, and you're having to give the testimony, if you move from one subject to another, they introduce themselves. Okay, now we know a little about you. Now I'm going to ask you questions about this. So framing what you're going to talk about and then asking the question is really, really valuable for kids. It gives them extra time. So if I'm changing subjects from like orientation to the reason they came, I might say something like, well, look, we talked a lot about being here, and I helped you understand what happens here. Now I want to talk about the reason you came. Frame it, and then asking, what did you come to talk to me about? Really, really helps kids understand and follow that conversation. So that's a really, really good technique. And again, we already talked about this a bit. Try your best. If you have to write it down, if you're doing testimony, if you're going to meet with a child, so all these different concepts that are in court, or your job or your role, think about what that's like from a child's point of view, and even sort of thinking, how can I explain this in a more clear way? The incident occurred prior to, all these different really, legal speak that can be broken down into simple language. And if you think about that, the children will follow you much better. Okay. And again, when you're talking to different age groups, who, what, where starts first. even down 3, 4, most kids can get that. When for every child is going to be tough, okay? I understand time frames are really important, particularly in charging, but you can get time frames from other sources. You can get time frames for if the child says they live in an apartment that time. You can get, from other sources when they live in that apartment. Just because a child knows today is Wednesday, just because a child knows it's 2 o'clock right now, doesn't mean they can remember what time something happened. And the example I use sometimes in training is if if I said to the audience, well, off the top of your head, when was your last dental appointment? I mean, you can't do that as an adult. So it's very, very difficult for kids to understand and accurately report, exactly when that something happened. Now, so have a reasonable expectation for that. Like, would you know the last date your dental visit? No. But you can give them a little wiggle room. So if I have a child who had something happen and they say something happened, I might say, well, look, don't guess, but about how old do you think you were when that happened? And if they say, 7 or 8, my follow-up question is, what makes you think that? Was something happening? Or another way of doing this is, you said that your uncle touched you. Help me understand, what was going on around that time when your uncle touched you? Tell me about other things that were happening around that time. Tying to events. It's not really that helpful to ask, was it before Christmas, after Christmas? Because again, was your last dental appointment before April, Memorial Day or after April Memorial Day? You'd have to look at your calendar for that. So that tying to sort of national holidays or birthdays, it can be problematic, okay? About how old were you if things happen more than one time? About how old do you think it started? What makes you think it was around that time? And then follow-up question: how old do you think you were when this stopped? What helps you remember that? So giving some wiggle room about time frames and taking time frames with a grain of salt. Young kids particularly come in and say, well, yesterday he came in last week and he did that to me last week. They're not meaning last week. That's just a long time ago to a 5-year-old. Okay. So I think we all understand that, but I think your interviewer and if you as a prosecutor can help the jury understand that in terms of time frame will be really, really helpful. Okay. Here's the thing about the problem with the word why. Who, what, where, when is tough. Why is the other, and then how many. And again, I use the same example. So how many times have you been to the dentist? If things happen more than one time, you're going to encourage a guess when you ask how many times. You can ask, most kids will understand it happened one time or more than one time, or would it happen one time or lots of times? Was that just on one day or lots of different days? Right? But that kind of question in terms of how many is really tough. And the idea of why sounds really pejorative. It sounds like something you did wrong. And the example I use in training is if you go to your supervisor, if your supervisor calls you into the supervisor's office and the supervisor says, sit down, and the first word your supervisor utters is why, right? You're automatically going, oh my God, what did I do wrong, right? So this is like the Me Too movement, right? So why didn't you tell is the question on everybody's mind. The jury's mind, DSS workers' mind, Child Protective Services mind, law enforcement, maybe your mind, the parent's mind. Why didn't you tell? That has a sense of you did something wrong because you didn't tell. And instead of asking those phrasings, a really nicer way to say it is, how come? So how come that happened? Something about how come it makes more sense to little kids without being pejorative. Or what's the reason? So when I'm talking to kids about discovery or how things came out, it's more, hey, like not why didn't you tell? It's, hey, what's the reason? What made you decide to tell? What's the reason you decided not to tell? Help me understand that. And so that's a much less pejorative way of talking to kids. So again, kids generally have developmental levels. Every kid is different. Every kid has cultural issues, language issues, developmental issues, environmental factors, so much variability in terms of what this 5-year-old could do versus this 5-year-old. There's some generalities, but every child has to be assessed for their particular language abilities, their developmental level, how they communicate. Some children with special needs, some kids with, language issues, autism spectrum, they all communicate differently. But you can determine that with building some relationship with them, which we'll talk about in 1 second. Okay. So really taking every child for who they are and understanding each unique child's ability by spending some time with them. Right? So how do you do that? So let's talk more about how this might be relevant to what you folks do. So a lot of times when I talked about talking with kids, I think what happens is people don't really get any training on how to talk to kids. And then they try and talk to kids, and the kids are kind of like, they don't really have a real good conversation with this kid. And then then it becomes this thing of like, well, kids are really hard to talk to. I don't know how, and they're really hard. And so I'm getting intimidated by it because they don't really talk a lot. Believe me, if you get even a 14-year-old boy talking, stand back, because this kid will it's like 15 minutes of nonstop talking without breathing. So it's really a question of how you do talk to kids. And part of this is building a conversation, okay? Here's my take on this, which is really 4 key concepts. One is, before you even start, and as you first enter into this relationship with this kid, whether it's you're the prosecutor, you may talk to them about the abuse situation, you may prep for trial, you may go into detail what kind of things are going to happen. But really, what is that child's perception of you? How do you develop some rapport and engagement with this child? How do you elicit this account? I mean, even for testimony, if the child's up on the stand or teenagers on the stand, how do you get them to say things in their own words to help the jury understand what their experience was? And then we're going to talk about asking for subjective details, which is really, really important. So how do you do these things? So consider before you even start this idea of, before I even start talking to this kid, when I first meet this child, it's this idea of anybody, whether children, adults, anybody, people feel more comfortable and they feel more connected with people if they're talking to someone who predicts kind of what happens, prepares you what happens next. Not the outcome, but just what generally the steps of things. So for instance, when kids come to my clinic, the first thing I do is I say, hi, my name is Scott. I work with a doctor. Here's what's going to happen today. I'm going to talk to you because I help the doctor. The doctor's also going to give you a checkup. I'm going to show you around so you see everything. Right? So listen, if you have any questions, ask any questions you have. But here's what I'm going to do. Let me go get some things ready. I'll be right back. Okay, let the child process that. Then everything I do when I talk to the child is I show the child around the clinic. I show the child the exam rooms. I ask them if they have any questions. I explain to them it's the doctor's office. I ask them, what does the doctor usually do? That's what the doctor's going to do here. Here's where your mom is going to be talking to the doctor. Here's where I talk to you. Here's the recording. Here's why I record things. Because I can't write everything down. I can't remember every single thing you say, and I got to get things right for the doctor. So every step of the way is preparing what's going to happen. Okay. And think about that to me, and think about this presentation, talking to other people, is I think that's, in terms of the times of COVID, that's what's part of what's been so hard. Because most people's lives, you go about in your life and it's, fairly predictable, and you expect certain things to happen, but COVID's really taken that away. And if you think about the idea of unpredictability, people don't do well with unpredictability. And if you are nervous, worried, anxious, you don't have a lot of brain space to access memory. You don't have a lot of brain space to access memory and then communicate things if you're so worried, anxious about stuff. And so this times of COVID has really taken away that sense of control, that sense of prediction of what's going to happen, and unpredictability, as well as just physical risk and harm and everything else. So the idea that you can predict, here's what's going to happen, not here's how the case is going to come out, but here's kind of what's going to happen. Even today, I'm going to talk to you a little while. We'll get to know each other. I'll tell you some things about this case. Then we'll talk and we'll meet again in a couple of weeks to go over some other things. If you don't convey a genuine interest in somebody, then what's the point of them talking to you, right? So this idea of when you build a relationship with somebody, before you even start, conveying a sense of genuine interest in that person's experience and valuing what that person has to say and what that child's experience is. And if you don't do that, why is the child going to talk to you, right? And the other thing I think is projecting yourself as a person who's confident, who projects themselves as a safe person. And let me explain that. So like I always ask people to work with kids, think about what it was like for you when you were a kid. Okay, think about like elementary school. Let me get some caffeine. So if the fire alarm goes out, yeah.
Time check, and then it's 4:03.
Awesome, perfect timing. So here's what we do. I want to sort of think about how a teacher projects themselves with a fire alarm, right? And if the teacher's really freaked out, then the children will be really freaked out. But if the teacher's confident and safe, then the children respond really well to that. Okay, so how do we do that? This is an example of what not to do. So, and unfortunately, it's like rapport is really seen as like a checklist, and that's really not what it is. Rapport is really ongoing. So you don't just ask, questions, check, I got to know you, and then we're going to talk about something. What you want to really do is, like, again, why would you share anything with somebody who's not concerned for you? And let me give you some really quick hints about this. You build a conversation with narrative prompts, right? The key things to understand is the personalization with you questions and the key idea of, you said that, tell me more about that. And let me show you this works. So instead of sort of asking random questions, you can say, hey, look, it's nice to meet you. I want to get to know you a little bit. Tell me about things you like to do. I've never really met you before. Anything the child says, I like to play with friends, do gymnastics. You have so many options just by asking about you. You personalize the conversation. What do you like about it? How did you get started? What do you like about it? If the child does competitions, hey, look, tell me all about the competitions you do. It's a very, very simple way to personalize the conversation, narrative phrasing, build this conversation, and teach the child that I expect we're going to have as a relationship. Right? So really starting to think about how you build a relationship, it really starts from the very beginning, how you present yourself, not just going through the motions of rapport, but actually really taking some time to get to know this kid. What makes this kid tick? When you want to have the child talk to you about something, whether you talk to the child or looking for something within a child interview. If you talk about eliciting an account, so most children and teens expect the adults to do a lot of the questions. But if you are that genuinely curious, tell me about that. Wait, you said you're in gymnastics. You said this, tell me about that. Wait, you said that, tell me about that. If you do that in rapport engagement and sort of set that standard early in the conversation, the child is going to use that same kind of phrasing, or you use the same phrasing later on. And that's how you elicit an account. Wait, you said this, tell me more about that part. Try the narratives first before you resort to those what questions, multiple choice, yes, no questions. Okay, so let me show you this works. The general idea, just step by step. If you're in the position where you need to talk to a kid about what may have happened to them, or if you're looking at an interview and watching this, a really nice way of doing this is the child says X happened. A really nice way of doing that is ask the child, tell me everything about what happened from beginning to end. Okay, for younger kids, you might have to adjust to like what happened. They say, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. Before I resort to anything else, before I say, well, what, ask about this, what happened next? What happened then? What else happened? Tell me everything happened after that. Because you want to get a really, really complete initial narrative account. So what happened from the beginning to end? What happened then? What happened then? Tell me what happened then. Once you get to the end of that concern, the end of whatever incident they're talking about, then you can go back and clarify what they said. And the best way to do this is to use narratives. Okay, so tell me everything from beginning to end. What happened then? What happened then? What happened then? And then go back. Okay, you said this part. Help me understand this part. Okay, and then I think I got this. And then, oh wait, you said you heard him come in the room. Tell me everything about that. And next you say you start doing that. Tell me everything about that. So that technique really, really elicits a very long, detailed account for the kids. And then you can intersperse with the thoughts and the what questions, yes, no questions. But that's a really nice way to start. The other thing that you have to understand is, and what I think would be very valuable for people in the field, particularly prosecutors, children and teens are not going to talk about how they felt, what they thought necessarily unless they're asked. And the key here is, if you're talking to a child about something that happened to them, if you start to introduce this idea of, what did you think about that? How did you feel when he locked the door? You said he touched your private part. How did your private part feel when he did that? Again, this is the statements the child has already made to you. The children will then elicits a subjective details. The idea here is, the key here is, if the child says anything, I was scared, I was hurt, it hurt, I was sad, always follow that up with, tell me about it. Tell me about, you said you were scared. What made you scared about that? You said your private part hurt. Help me understand. How come it was hurting? Tell me about it hurting on you. And you get incredible subjective details from kids that really sort of open up their experience for other people to understand. Okay. So the other thing to really think about is I'm going to skip this because we'll get to the questions at the end. But how is all this related to sort of avoiding concerns that you folks might have for kids who may be avoidant, may be difficult to talk to, reluctance, recantation? So here's some ideas. So we talked a little about how to build a relationship. We talked about how to listen to an account, and sort of using those 3-4 strategies. Tell me everything from beginning to end, what happened then, and then going back and clarifying. You said this, tell me about that. Asking those suggestive details, subjective details. But a lot of people are concerned with, okay, well, I have this report, but then this kid she's taking it back. Or it's really hard to talk to this kid about this stuff. So what we want is, we want an accurate history, whether the child was abused or not. But we know that there's worries, fears, barriers. And we also know that kids are not going to come in and say, hey, look, I really can't talk to you right now, because if I talk to you, my mom's going to lose her house because my stepdad paid the rent, right? So asking kids about this stuff. Hey, look, some kids are worried about when they talk about this kind of stuff. Are you worried about this? Are you not only worried about any worries, are you worried about what's going to happen now? These are really, really important questions to understand, because you understand why a child might have some reluctance to talk, why a child might have pressure to recant. Barriers can be internal. They might feel guilty. I should have done something. I don't know what's going to happen. They can be familial. Everything that the alleged offender said is going to happen. My family got broken up. We're going to lose the house. My stepsister's going to grow up without a dad, just like I did. There can be coercion threats. If you don't ask about these things, or if your interviewer doesn't ask about these things and you're now talking to the child, I highly recommend talking to the child about, do you have any worries about what's going to happen? Are you worried about getting in trouble? Are you worried about getting other people in trouble? Because this helps you understand what's motivating this child at this point. Family members can be influential. Family members can be positive or negative. So really understanding what's happening with this child that may really impede their ability to provide accurate history and be engaged in this process. You do this, you mitigate these concerns by, again, your report. If you show genuine interest in this child, if you build this appropriate relationship, I care about you, I value what prosecution may not be the best thing here. Help me understand that. Let's have a conversation about what's valuable for you. Then you can overcome a lot of this reluctance. Do you have worries? If the child says anything, well, kind of, sort of, really, a little bit, tell me about that. Tell me everything about that. Are you worried about talking to me? Are you worried something's going to happen? Is a really valuable question, okay? So understanding that there may be forces that are affecting this child's ability to report and continue the process. The other thing to really think about is, now that this report has been made, there's a case. Talk to the account about, how do people find out? again, we talked about this before, not why didn't you tell, but how did people find out about this? What made you decide to tell? What was going on that made you decide to tell that person right then? What happened after you told? What's been happening now? What's happened since you told? So understanding what forces were influencing disclosure, what forces are influencing the child post-disclosure, and what forces are influencing the child now, whether internal or external. And this, again, we're not guaranteeing that there's no recantation. There's plenty of literature and research on recantation. It can be expected in some cases, but you're helping mitigate those circumstances. There could be cultural issues. I mean, fear of the system. We work with a fairly high immigrant population around here, so fear of the system. They don't get deported. So there's going to be familial issues. Work with your family system. Work with your MDT. Work with if there's a financial loss because of this guy's in jail, have an advocate work with his family. Have counselors involved. Have mental health workers working with your family, not just the kid. The family is going through a loss. This guy's in jail. You got little kids in the house. Work with MDT to get support for this family. I've talked to people on military bases. They're going to lose military housing. Their family's in Kansas. They're stationed in Quantico, and they're going to lose military housing, all the benefits. What do you expect, right? So thinking about the family system and working with the MDT and supporting the family system is another way to mitigate against reluctance. Okay. So wanted to make sure, I know some of this was a bit quick, I know. Again, these kind of trainings that we provide for interviewers goes into much more detail about a lot of these issues. I can't help another plug, find out your models, find out how your models are defended in your area. Go to interviewing training. The book by Ann Grafton Walker, I think, is a must read for anybody working with kids because it has a much more in detail about what we talked about here. I wanted to give you just, again, an overview of how things work. Certainly able to answer any questions if anything comes up, but just wanted to leave some time for that now.
Thank you so much, Scott. I have some questions we're going to start off with from participants when they signed up for the training. And our first question is, well, what trainings or certifications do you recommend? And here I want to highlight that these are prosecutors asking this question, and lots of these trainings take a week. What is your feeling about? Is there a shorter training that prosecutors could do, or is there something you could recommend specifically for prosecutors?
I think so. Interviewers, most interviewers who actually do this for a living, there's standards for interviewing that a lot of interviewers are in child advocacy centers across the country. Child advocacy centers have certain standards, and most of the interviewers who do this full time due to the 4 to 4.5 day training that's accredited by the National Children's Association for child advocacy centers. I mean, look, it's expensive. It takes time. If you're able to do that, absolutely. The other way to do that is really some national conferences are very, very strong. There's a national conference put on the National Children's Advocacy Center down in Huntsville, Alabama, puts on a yearly training. APSAC puts on training. These are multidisciplinary trainings, and not limiting yourself to prosecutory workshops, but really attending some of these trainings, learning about, there's plenty of stuff on interviewing for these national trainings that are really, really helpful on memory, suggestibility, children's language, how to talk to kids. So I think, understanding the time and resource constraints of attending an interview training. The other thing is really sitting down with the interviewers, sitting down with your local advocacy centers, sitting down with your MDT, and really talking about how we're going to talk to and how we're going to address these issues, these kids. And the other thing I will say, even like peer review for interviewers is really important. If you're able to talk with the other prosecutors about, hey, is there something else I can be doing? I'm having difficulty with this teenagers I just don't talk to really well. Talk to other folks and see if we get that. So it could be informal as well.
Great. And I know for prosecutors just beginning, when I started off in juvenile court, I got my first child sex abuse case, and I thought that this was a one-off and I wouldn't see too many more of those. But you will see if you're in juvenile court and you're just beginning, you will see many, many of them. And so now is the perfect time just to get this training, because actually research tells us about 40% of all child sexual abuse against children is committed by juveniles. So it's definitely not one-off if you've only seen one or two so far, and now's a good time at the beginning to get this training, because I think Scott's shown us how invaluable it can be, just in, if not in prosecution, but in your daily life, talking to other people, talking to your own children. Very helpful. So another question.
Also, by the way, if you happen to get a child sexual abuse case in either whatever the defendant is, you're then, if it's like our area, you're now the expert. So you're not just going to get one. Every other one is going to come your way. So congratulations.
Yes. So another question we have is, how do you inquire about a child's ability to tell a truth versus lie? Lots of prosecutors have to open up with this to establish the competency of the victim. And I know this is done also in the interview process. So if you can explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So just to mitigate this a little bit, or just a little caveat. So an interview, there again, going back to the article in Abstract, the September 2020 has the interview models and the explanation of all those models. Some models do a ceremony of a truth lie, some don't. The caveat is that a truth lie ceremony in an interview is different than an oath in court. So understanding that difference. So if I'm talking to a child about telling true things in my interview, that's not the same thing as taking an oath. So that being said, I think maybe it'd be helpful to explain sort of in what I do in terms of the model I use. It's more of, there's research in terms of asking kids to promise to tell true things. That, again, going back to Tom Lyon, there's the word promise that makes a difference for kids. If you say, will you tell true things? If you promise to tell true things, kids understand that better. Younger kids, it's a demonstration. So instead of saying to a 6-year-old, what does it mean to tell the truth? If I hold this stick up, is it green? Is that the truth? People do it different ways. For me, and the sort of the practice we do here, it's a demonstration. So there's a drawing about depicting a child who one throws a rock and hits a window, one doesn't. And you explain that account. What this child says, that if the girl throws a rock and says the boy threw it, is the girl telling the truth or a lie? Most kids would be like, no, she told a lie, that's not right. So there's a demonstration of, is this a true thing, or is this girl telling the truth, or is this girl telling a lie? And then that's followed in an interview context with, so the reason I drew this and made this drawing to talk about true things is because I want you to promise to tell true things. Will you promise to tell true things when you're here today? So that's one technique in an interview setting. So again, talk to other prosecutors, check out research models, or interview models, check out the model you're using in your area. Again, it's slightly different than an oath, but the general idea would be younger kids would need a demonstration of that versus just the abstract concept of telling a true thing. It might be harder for a 6-7-year-old kid.
Great. We have a question here about, how does a large time gap between the child's first coming forward and testimony in court affect recall? We all know, unfortunately, that you get a case and it could be 6 months to a year, and in an adult court, 2 or 3 years before it gets to trial. So how does that affect a child's ability to recall the incident?
Well, there's a difference though between sort of recalling an incident and then remembering it later. Okay, so one thing would be, hopefully interviews are recorded either in video, hopefully in video and audio. So that's one issue. So I was just reading up some articles today. It's this notion of having a child's memory and sort of erode over time, can be an issue. I don't claim to be an expert on memory, but I can tell you that this idea of having meetings with a child may be helpful. If you are able to have a meeting with a child to talk about the situation, not to re-interview them over and over. That's not what I'm saying. but some idea of, do you remember what we talked about? See if the child can recollect some of the things. Can you have the child, review a video before of what happened earlier? It may be helpful. Again, every jurisdiction is really different, but I do think that what you're looking for really is to look for really two things. The age of child may be difficult as well. Younger children tend to have memory erosion over a little quicker than older kids. So one, can you document things really well at the beginning of the case? And two, you're also looking for all those issues outside the interview that may influence the child. Not only recantation, but also not having people re-interview this kid 16,000 times, not having parents ask the kid 16,000 times what happened. So the suggestibility of outside influences, which may affect the child's memory between the time that the interview started, the case opened, and the time the case is actually coming to trial. And having a conversation with the child about what they talked about, in my view, using sort of narrative techniques, tell me about what you talked with Scott about, is not contamination of the child's later account. Asking really highly suggestive questions from the time the child was interviewed and asking highly suggestive questions all in the beginning up until the time of the case, that would be a problem. But asking the child, hey, tell me more about what you remember about talking with Scott. Tell me what you remember about what happened. And between the time the case started and trial, unfortunately, it can be an issue. I mean, it's 18 months, a year to 18 months before I see a child, I might get subpoenaed for a case. Along the way, I would also hope that there's sort of court prep and having this child prepare. And some, again, not re-interviewed about what exactly happened, but some recollection. Remember you talked to Scott, what do you remember about that, along the way to help remind the child about what they said earlier. And then you always have that video to say, hey, look, this is what the child looked like 2 years ago. They grew, not to get off track, I went to a case one time that was 4 years. I didn't recognize the kid. It was ridiculous. They had in a complete, almost a half a life since I talked to the child. So having documentation early and understanding that, is a child going to remember every single thing they said 4 years ago? No, I don't remember things I said yesterday. So having some explanation for that to the jury may be helpful, and having a memory expert might be helpful as well, or an interviewer who could speak to that.
And Scott, why is it you don't want to interview a child a bunch of times over that 6 months, 18 months, 2 years?
So there's a difference, let me be clear, there's a difference between multiple interviewers and multiple interviews. Research is increasingly supporting the idea of the same interviewer interviewing the child more than one time. It can actually be very helpful. That child actually may be able to give more information as they go. And particularly young kids. I talk to kids who are 4-year-old, they come to my clinic, and 4-year-old in a 40-minute interview is going to tell me, no, they need time to sort of get to know somebody. So the same interviewer talking to the child more than one time about what may have happened is perfectly appropriate in most cases. The problem, because when multiple interviewers are doing the same duplicative work, law enforcement talks to the kid, then they go to the child advocacy center, then they go, they need a medical center, so they need to go to the hospital and have it interviewed there. And then, oh, by the way, the victim advocate needs to talk to him. Tell me everything that happened. So you start to run the risk of not only exhaustion and sort of having this child do duplicative work. And most of the time, kids get really irritated by that, and then they start to either resist talking, resist the process. You also, because the interviewers may not, in the number of interviews, number of interviewers, those additional interviewers may not be as skilled in narrative questions. The yes, no, tend to be more suggestive questions. Then you start to have the risk of influencing this child's initial statements. The initial report was narrative. Then you start, these other interviewers are asking all these questions, including parents, including grandparents, including all these other people. So again, working with your family to say, hey, look, don't be grilling this child all the time about what happened. It's not just the professionals. But that's what you
Right.
run the risk of. That's what you run the risk of.
You want the main body of evidence to be a professional interview, and not have a lot of people that don't know exactly what they're doing, but have had some training following up.
Right. And again, just to be clear, I'm trying to get as much A to Z as possible and share it with investigators. The investigator might take this little slice of it and say, hey, I need to know more about where the DVD, what camera was used, or where this computer was. So you could, a lot of times, you have professionals asking specific questions about certain things, but not doing an A to Z interview, and then an A to Z interview, and then an A to Z interview, and then an A to Z interview. That's where you run into issues.
But in your jurisdiction, law enforcement knows to come back to you and ask for a follow-up interview if they need more particulars.
If needed, or even advice about how I can. So, have the child look at the video and say, okay, well, now you told Scott this. I didn't understand this part. Help me understand about this part that you told Scott. May be really helpful.
Great.
But not do everything from beginning to end again.
Yes. All right. Well, it looks like we are running out of time. I know that there are a lot of questions that were pretty legal in nature and vary across jurisdictions. So I plan on getting back to people who ask those types of questions next week. And very happy that all of you joined us. Extremely happy that Scott Snyder was able to speak to you today. And I'll hand it over to William.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. And to our audience members, just to let you all know, like Rachel mentioned, we will be able to send out some of the responses to some of those questions that we received. But before we wrap up, just a few. You're going to compliment Scott saying nice beard here. I think that's
COVID beard.
The COVID beer, right? So yes, before we wrap up, just a couple of last-minute items. You all saw in the link that my colleague and co-host has provided a link where you can click on it and provide an evaluation, a survey. Sorry, not evaluation, a survey for today's web event. If you could please click on that link, and you're able to go in and actually submit the survey and let us know how we did. The survey is very imperative, and we do appreciate you all in advance for providing your feedback on these webinars that are hosted by our colleagues at NDAA. They help with the continued improvement, if you will, of these surveys. And it's I know I probably speak for NDAA by saying that they're very grateful when you all do complete the survey and send that information in. So please, please be sure to click on that link and complete the survey. Reminder to folks that we will indeed send out the certificates in 24 hours. Please keep an eye out in your email for those certificates that you'll receive. Another reminder to our audience that if you'd like to get in contact with NTTAC, you can do so through the information on this slide. You can also check us out on Facebook at OJJDP NTTAC to learn about upcoming trainings and additional resources. If you'd like to get in contact with OJJDP's help desk, learn more about JuveJust or any other upcoming events, you may do so through the information on this slide. And before I move on, let me go ahead and do a quick file share of these items just so folks can get access to them. You all will see in the file share pod there a PDF of the webinar of today that includes those links there that you can click on. And so you can feel free to go ahead and just access that PDF there at your leisure. And then also while folks are filing out, let me go ahead and put up a quick poll question. On this poll question, all we want to know is how do you plan to apply your the knowledge that you learned today? And so in the poll, you'll see that a poll will come up, and we just basically want to know how you plan to apply the information that you learned today. So as you're filing out of the room, please be sure to complete that poll question. Do you have a training or technical assistance need? Well, if so, we're asking for you to please submit a request through the OJJDP NTTAC 360 platform. This platform can be accessed through the URL on this slide. A reminder, as I mentioned earlier, please note that the events are archived on our YouTube page where you can access additional webinars on juvenile justice and child victimization prevention related topics. If you like any supporting materials, you can contact the OJJDP NTTAC Help Desk at the email on this slide. And finally, a last reminder that we will indeed have a few other webinars coming up with our colleagues over at the Innocence Foundation as well. They have a part 5 and part 6 of a 6-part series that they'll be wrapping up in the month of May. So we do ask for you to go ahead and register for those webinars and click Learn More to learn more about those web events. Other than that, that's all that we have for today. Thank you again to our presenters. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Scott. You all have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you all on the next webinar coming up soon. Take care.
Thanks, William.
Thank you.
Bye, Scott.
Thank you.